This is Revolution Podcast. Trying to start the week off right. I mean, granted, we drop an episode Sunday, and that's technically the start of the week, but for most of the people that listen, it's like the end of the week. The Monday show is the start of the week. This past Sunday show, though, would have been from the Pascal Robert Mau Mau Hour, where he asks the question, should there be class warfare within the black community? I mean, I think you guys know what the answer would be coming from us. But the great thing about the Mau Mau Hour is if you are a patron, then we air it first for you, where you can literally interact with Pascal in real time. He has about a 20-minute or so script he's going to go off of, where he wants to, first voice his opinion, a bit of an editorial, if you will. And you can be the real-life comment section. Unfortunately, the phone system that we have requires at least two of us to run it, meaning I would have to host it, and we have to have someone else screening calls, and being that I am alone here in Mexico, and me, Jean Bajlan, is, taking care of his family and the new addition to the Bajlan clan. But I think we're getting some help. I'm not going to say where it's coming from exactly, but it's definitely staying within the This is Revolution family to handle phone calls, because I want to get back to doing phone calls for the bonus patron half of the show. So if you are not a patron and you want to be part of this call-in segment, the best way to do it, there's links in the description wherever you're listening to this show. And you can go to patreon.com/Bitter Lake Presents. Also, release some new music. If you enjoy the music that you hear on this audio only, I constantly play a lot of the instrumentals on here as well. The clips that we play, if you enjoy those, I make that music. Doug Lane, recently formerly of Zero Books, now he's got his own thing called Diet Soap Media. Be on the lookout. There's actually some authors that are moving over to have some books on diet soap. I'm actually pretty excited. Doug got in my ear about trying to expand on my ideas for the piece I wrote, I Was a Teenage Anarchist, to turning it into a book, which I've been working on. Another reason why I'm way out here. Of course, Pascal's been working on a book, so there's some good stuff that's going to come out of Doug's new venture. And he'll also be having some programming on the This is Revolution channel as well. So every Wednesday on our This is Revolution channels and all our social media, we run a different show that doesn't necessarily revolve around Pascal and I. So the first Wednesday of every month, we have our movie review show. We review it's a leftist review of different films, not necessarily all brand new. I believe the month of December, they're going to be doing all science fiction, and I do have some plans for that, because I have been talking with Dr. Michael Harris, who wrote Welcome to the Rebellion, the book about Star Wars, and Stay Alive, the book about the Hunger Games, and using these pop culture references as kind of larger narratives for the left, things we can learn from, things that inspire us as well. Because we can feel defeated a lot, I think, in the left. And some of what I see in this echo chamber of the leftist podcast universe, it sounds like the language of the defeated. So I think Dr. Michael Harris's books are very important books. And I was talking about doing a show with him and Dan Larson of Toy Galaxy, one of my favorite shows. If you are a older millennial or a Gen Xer, Toy Galaxy is probably one of the best shows out there when it comes to going back to the capitalist realism of our lives. That music means I've went too long, but this show is about the great Hubert Harrison, a figure that is often forgotten. We get into the weeds of his legacy. This is a show we've wanted to do for a long time with Dr. Jeff Perry. I am out. Good evening, everyone. As I'm telling you this in the morning, welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. Happy holidays, if you will. This is our special Thanksgiving episode. We are pre-recording this episode, so if there's any chat conversation that we don't respond to, it's because we literally can't see it. The music that I'm playing in the background is from the latest release of instrumental music that goes with a lot of the clips that we make here for the show. And I say we because there are multiple contributors to the text that I read. And I never tell people who writes what, because I love it when you guys guess, because usually you guys guess wrong. That being said, let me bring in my homie, my co-host, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert. Give it up, everybody, for Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the audience, because there's no chat right now.
There is no chat. For us, there is a chat that's going to go on, and God knows what they are going to be saying about us for saying the word Thanksgiving. Who knows? Where I am at right now, apparently Thanksgiving is celebrated, but on Saturday.
Okay.
So everything will be open for me on Thursday. And I was able to watch football in English. So I'm very excited about
That's progress.
That is progress. And my Spanish is getting slightly better. And Pascal knows why.
Yeah, I do.
So this episode for us is a bit of a big deal. When Pascal and I first got together, and I was telling Pascal what I wanted to do was reintroduce this idea. And I shouldn't say idea, reintroduce more Black people to Black socialists, Black political thought that's not trapped in 60s radicalism. Because I think a lot of Black political thought that we go back to kind of stays between 68 to 72, right? If it's not Kwame Ture, or maybe you find a fiery Malcom X speech, then, you know, people want to pull out some Huey Newton quotes. And that's kind of where that radical thought stays. And one thing Pascal always said was, and he said it actually recently on a show, he goes, I'm more interested in Black radical thought in the 20s and 30s. You know, think about that era of segregation, of lynching. And one of the first names he named was Hubert Harrison. And he said, man, if we could get that white boy Jeff Perry on the show that wrote that Hubert Harrison book, that'd be a good episode. And I don't know what happened. I don't know if we tried, if we didn't try as hard. You know, a lot has happened in the last year when it comes to guests we have been trying to get. And through social media, which as much as we criticize it, I do have to say there are some positives of social media. And this show is one of those positives. Someone had mentioned that we should have Jeff Perry on the show and tagged him on a Facebook post. And I said, I would love to have Jeff Perry on the show. Jeff Perry responded, sent me his email, and here we are. So without any further ado, please welcome the author of multiple volumes of Hubert Harrison's life, Jeff Perry.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Pascal, very, very much. I really appreciate having this opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier when we were speaking, it's really an opportunity to bring Hubert Harrison to current and future generations, and so people can build off it and draw from it and learn from it. So I'm going to go through some notes I have from previous talks. Over the years, I've done over 100 talks, a few continents, cross-country. Matter of fact, I was going to mention this later, but Jason, I believe you're in Oakland. Is that correct?
I just moved to Mexico, but Oakland is
okay. Well, if you go to my webpage, which I'm going to give in a second, right there on the left-hand side, the front page, is Yuri Kochiyama holding up the first volume of the Harrison biography. Now, Yuri Kochiyama is the woman who gave mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to Malcolm at the Audubon Ballroom. She and her family were very close with Malcolm and his family, and she passed away a few years ago, but two of her children are still out there, and they've been paying a lot of attention to her more recently, Yuri Kochiyama. But just a little Oakland connection for you there. But,
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Even though I'm no longer in Oakland, it's literally where I was born and where I've spent the majority of the Bay Area is where I spent the majority of my 44 years, and it is always a part of me. And I will have the word hella in the Mexican lexicon in no time. Don't you worry. I want to start off with this quote that you have in, I did watch your multiple hour presentation on Hubert Harrison, and I was very mad at whoever the sound person was because they did a disservice to the presentation by having poor sound. I could barely hear. But Hodge Kiernan, who was quoted, he was an elevator operator in an art gallery and a subject of an art piece. I can't remember the artist's name off the top of my head. But this quote really stuck out to me, and I want to start off with this. Harrison lived with and amongst his people, not on the fringes of their social life. And just real quick, and I'll go off air because I know Pascal has a ton of questions. Why Hubert Harrison? What about Hubert Harrison stuck out to you? Because I know you discovered him while you were doing research for something else. So what about Hubert Harrison, Jeff, stuck you to the point where you were like, I need this rabbit hole, because you went down a rabbit hole with this man, you know, getting in touch with his family, having the family give you all the hundreds of pages of text, to the point where you end up getting the diary from his daughter. So you can't get that kind of documentation, sacred documentation, from a family unless you've earned their trust. And you can't earn that trust unless you are very serious and sincere with your respect and admiration for someone. So what was it about Harrison that sticks out to you and makes you say, not only do I want to know more, but the people at large must know more?
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, my roots are entirely working class. I did get to go to good schools along the way, and I worked in the labor movement for 30 some odd years. But when I was working on a dissertation at Columbia under Nathan Huggins and Hollis Lynch, two outstanding historians, I was writing on why no socialism in the U.S., and I was looking at documents. One second, excuse me.
Call from wireless caller.
1 second. Damn.
It's all good, Jeff. It's just, we're going to make fun of you for having a landline.
Yeah, no, I get about 20 of these things a day.
Jeff still got a landline.
I got cell phones too, but that's
how you know he's a trusted individual. He's got a landline.
I was writing Why No Socialism in the U.S., and I was particularly looking at the period from the turn of the 20th century. And I'm a very serious researcher, and I was going through all the Socialist Party and all the variants of the socialist movement, looking at their writings, particularly paying attention to questions of race and class. I was doing that because I had been influenced for the previous 10 years by the work of Theodore W. Allen, who's also an autodidactic working class intellectual, who pioneered a class struggle-based analysis of white skin privilege in the mid-1960s and wrote the seminal 2 volumes on the invention of the white race, Verso, which came out first in 1994 and 1997, and we have a 3rd edition coming out in January in 1 volume. They're going to consolidate it. So my antennas were up. And as I'm reading some of the literature, all of a sudden I come across in articles by Richard B. Moore, who's from Barbados, but had been active with the African Blood Brotherhood, Communist Party, and movements for West Indian Federation and Liberation, and ran a 125th Street bookstore in Harlem for many years, and whose daughter, Joyce Moore Turner, who is now 100 years old, I stay in frequent touch with. And only last year, she had an article at age 100 published in one of the journals of Caribbean history. She's just remarkable. And Richard B. Moore, so articles by Richard B. Moore. Hold on. That's the other phone. They're really coming after me. Richard B. Moore and Philip Foner and J.A. Rogers. I came across articles by those people who talked about Hubert Harrison and said some very interesting things on him, Rogers in particular, more on Rogers in particular. I said, who is this guy? So I went up to the Schomburg Center, 135th Street in Harlem. And back then you had to print out off microfilm or microfiche the book. I took it home and read, I devoured them. I was totally arrested by Harrison's writings after I read them. And I said, gee, I got to write something on this guy. He's just too important. So I wrote a couple chapters, and back then you could send the same letter out and change the address. It was kind of an innovation technologically, in the technology. And I sent them out to librarians in various places, including the Caribbean. And a woman from St. Thomas wrote back to me and said she was related to the family, gave me contact information for the family. Son was living in Harlem on Bradhurst, and the daughter was living up in Yonkers. I contacted them and they said, okay, let's meet. And I went to meet them, and I brought a few chapters I had written. And we met another time and we discussed them a little bit. And then on the third meeting, as you indicated, they took me in the back room and they said, here, take these and do with these what you know you have to do with them. And so I was overwhelmed. I had arranged to go there because there was so much material, all these boxes. They had preserved them since 1927 when Harrison died. And then I took them to my place, and every day after work, I would transcribe. First, I preserved them. I became an archivist. I got archival boxes, acid-free paper, Mylar, all the things that archivists use. And I inventoried the papers. I transcribed them as best I could. I still had, our daughter was growing up, and I had to do, all the dad stuff because my wife was working later hours in New York, and did this for quite a number of years. But that's how I came on him. And because I was arrested by the clarity of his thought, particularly on two things. He understood the centrality of the struggle against white supremacy to radical social change in this country. And he understood that it was not in white workers' interests to support white supremacy or be, white supremacist or anything like that. It was not in their class interests. And most of the groups, even in the 60s and 70s when I'm growing up, and even today, they still don't get all of that. So that's how I came to him. And then I started working on it. And when I worked very diligently for quite a number of years. And in 1986, I finished my dissertation under Huggins and Lynch, and I passed my orals, and I took his daughter out, Ada, out to B. Smith's restaurant in the West 50s in New York. We were going to celebrate. I didn't have much money, but, we were going to celebrate. And as we were finishing the dinner, she reaches into her bag and she goes, Jeff, here's one more thing. And again, as you indicated earlier, she hands me his diary. Now, I had written a dissertation, I think I got it here, of 800 pages on Hubert Harrison, and I didn't even know his diary existed. So I knew I had a 2-volume biography. So I went to Historians Convention. First table I went to, LSU said, oh, please don't show it to anybody else. We want to publish it. And to make this story very short, I submitted them volume 1 of my proposed 2-volume biography. They sent it out to readers. It got rave reviews, but they didn't know what to do. Who's Harrison? Who am I? And what am I talking about 2 volumes? And we went through that song and dance for a decade and a half. Finally, Winston James, a friend of mine who was at Columbia at the time and who had used some of my Harrison dissertation when he wrote his book, Holding Aloft the Banner of Ethiopia, put me in touch with a publisher, an editor at Columbia, Peter Dimmock, and sat down with Peter Dimmock, and he says, Jeff, we can't talk while you're under contract. So we met again, and by that time I had broken the contract, and he said something that was very interesting, which stays with me to this day. He asked me, who do I write about besides Harrison? And I said, Theodore W. Allen. He goes, let me tell you something. And Peter Dimmock was senior editor at Columbia and former senior editor at Random House. And he said, Jeff, 95% of the historians out there don't know who Harrison or Allen, who they are. And of those who do, 95% feel they threaten their work. This is what he said, and I think that was accurate. That's how we got on that. I worked, volume 1 was completed. Let me just show people. Volume 1 was, while I was working on the biography, I put out a Hubert Harrison reader for Wesleyan University Press in 2001. Got a nice picture of Harrison on the cover. And if people go to my Facebook page, within the last week, I've put up postings indicating where these books you can get at special discounts in the current period. You can get this book for 35% off from Wesleyan University Press. That was 2001. Then I finished volume 1 of my Harrison biography in 2008. It's entitled Hubert Harrison, The Voice of Harlem Radicalism, 1883, the year he was born, until 1918. And there's Harrison, as serious as could be, at the Liberty Congress in 1918. That's what that front page picture is, William Monroe Trotter's at his side. You'll see it in the picture inside.
William Monroe Trotter was Du Bois's, what would you say, foil?
Well, but by 1918, well, we can get into this in a second. I just want to finish this story. Sure. Trotter and Harrison were leading in the critique of Woodrow Wilson's Make the World Safe for Democracy. They were demanding enforcement of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and federal anti-lynching legislation, while Wilson wants to make the world safe for democracy and go into war. And Harrison is arguing, let's make the South safe for democracy. So this was a leading oppositional voice in the African-American community in that period. But then I finished the second volume only last year, at the very end of last year. And this is 1,000 pages. This is Hubert Harrison, The Struggle for Equality, 1918 to 1927. Together, these two volumes are, I believe, I think I know what I'm talking about, the first full-length, multi-volume biography of an Afro-Caribbean, and only the fourth of an African-American after those of Booker T, W.E.B Dubois, and Langston Hughes. So this is major work, and it's written for those who will come after, as I've said, in particular, for people now, but the material is here. And one thing I want to mention about this second volume, because the technology keeps changing, and when I wrote this second volume, in the interim, in 2005, after Harrison's daughter died, Harrison's grandson said, Jeff, let's go place the papers. So we talked to Schaumburg, we talked to Library of Congress, Princeton, various places. Family decided on placing the papers at Columbia. They got all the money for it. I'm not a rip-off artist in this stuff. And then I delivered over 100 boxes up to Columbia of Harrison's materials. Part of the agreement was they would digitize a lot of the Harrison papers. And last year, they finally did digitize over 1,200 items, including Hubert Harrison's 220 plus page diary, which is freely available online. Again, I've put those links up on my webpage and on my Facebook page recently. People can easily find that stuff. And but in this volume, what's very interesting, as I mentioned earlier, in volume 2, Harrison writes some stunning articles on Haiti, on lots of things. But one thing he does is reviews a book by the pseudonymic Blair Niles. It's on Haiti. And but he does other things too on Haiti. But when he does book reviews or something like that in the early 20s, a lot of those books are now available online because they're not protected by copyright laws, and there are these places that post things like that up online where you can access them. So in my notes in volume 2, wherever Harrison does a review, if his review is included in the Harrison papers online, I link people to that. And if the book he's reviewing is available online, I link people to that. So you can really, see what he's saying, see what he's talking about, and judge for yourself. And I do that throughout. So that's part of the reason. The book really takes advantage, I think, of some of the latest, uses of the internet to make the reading better for those who are interested in that stuff, that research. And just one other thing I'll just mention, and then we'll get on. This came out in 2015. Harrison wrote a book in 1917, The Negro and the Nation. And then this book, When Africa Awakes, and it's got a subtitle, The Inside Story of the Stirrings and Strivings of the New Negro in the Western World. And it came out in 1920 when he was editing Marcus Garvey's Negro World. And this one I wrote, and I didn't write, I offered editorial comments and notes for Diasporic Africa Press, which is out of Brooklyn. And they published it, and it's out there, and that also information on that is also available online. There had been previous reprints of it, including a good quality one from Paul Coates' Black Classics Press. But even in that edition, they didn't have Harrison's introductory, which is very important. And they didn't even have the full title of the book, which is very important. the inside story of the stirrings and strivings of the new Negro in the Western world. So those are some of the works. And I've written probably 50 or 100 articles and done over 100 talks on Harrison over the years. So I'm sorry. That's part of the background. Now, can we talk about Harrison?
Yes, Jeff, without a question.
Yeah.
So my question, first of all, is that can you put Harlem in the early 20th century and Hubert Harrison coming from St. Croix in the context of what was the political and social milieu of Harlem, New York at that particular time? And why was it such a confluence of a battle of ideas around race, class, and Black political thought?
Okay, I will try. Well, first off, Harlem really starts to take off as a center after 1904, when the IRT subway is completed and the train goes up to Harlem. Because when Harrison first comes to New York in 1900 from St. Croix, he follows his sister, as many people from St. Croix and maybe other islands did. There was oftentimes a female who leads the way for others in the family. He follows his sister, and she was living on West 63rd Street. And that area was an area of African-American and Afro-Caribbean residents. And when he first comes, he starts getting nurtured in New York's political life on West 53rd Street in some lyceums, Lyceum of St. Benedict the Moor Church and St. Mark's AME Church, I believe, on West 53rd Street. Arthur Schomburg, Johnny Bruce, people like this are involved in these lyceums, and they're great because African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans coming together, discussing. They have weekly speakers, and it's a friendly atmosphere. You know, you can express your opinion, have differing opinions, and still be friends afterwards. And Harrison says for him and for others, that was the germ of Negro racial consciousness, those lyceums. So that's even before we start talking about moving to Harlem. But then after 1904, there's the move to Harlem, and there's a developing community. And Harrison's right there from those. There had been a Harlem presence previously, but as the activism, Harrison's right at the core of the early Harlem activism in 1916 and 17, when he's doing concentrated work. He's living for the most part on West 134th Street, and he's of the people. He walks down the street. The kids know him. Everybody knows him. He's a man of the people, as that Hodge Kiernan, in one of his quotes, mentions. He lived amongst the people. And he's there. And there were people also in Harlem. Business life, business leaders, and things like that. But Harrison was really trying to generate a bottom-up radicalism and activism. He had great faith in what he referred to as the common people, and these were who he was trying to reach. He thought they were the key, to the heart and soul of the Black community. He had, as he matured politically, he criticized Booker T. Washington for his policies, and Booker T. Washington, after Harrison wrote something about that, Booker T. had Harrison summarily fired from the post office in 1911. I detail that in Volume 1. And as a postal worker and a trade steward and things, I knew how to get Harrison's postal record. It was clean until Booker T. hammered him. And then he criticized W.E.B. Du Bois also in the early period. And he criticized W.E.B. Du Bois for a couple things. One thing was he thought the early NAACP had no answer for what to do if the white minds you're trying to reach didn't react positively, and he goes into that. The other thing Harrison was critical of was Du Bois's kind of notion of the talented 10th, who he believed should be preordained as the leaders of the race, the ones that should give guidance and things. And Harrison said, no, a little white blood doesn't preordain you to that, and we're not playing that, I'm not playing that. And Harrison, if you look at his pictures, he's very dark skinned, and that would be a factor throughout his life too. He comments on that at some points, that he he couldn't get a job on any but one black newspaper in New York. That black newspaper, I assumed he was talking about, was the Negro World, you know. He had his own newspapers. So Harrison starts doing concentrated work in the African American community. And by 1917, he founds the first organization and the first newspaper of the militant New Negro movement. And the newspaper is The Voice, and the organization is the Liberty League. And they precede all the stuff that comes afterwards with Randolph and Owen, with Cyril Briggs, with Marcus Garvey, all of them. He's preceding them all. And he has a good following, but he also does a couple of interesting things with his voice. First, when he founds the Liberty League, he founds it with a meeting on 132nd Street in 1917. And in it, he runs with the slogan, again, Wilson has led the US into war, and his slogan is "Let's make the world safe for democracy." But at his first rally for the Liberty League, he has Adam Clayton Powell Sr. come speak, a couple other speakers, and a young Marcus Garvey. Harrison was always willing to extend his platform to Garvey in those early years. And afterwards, when Harrison's group held meetings in an office down the hall, Garvey started holding meetings, and Harrison would encourage people to go to Garvey's meetings after his meetings, you know. So Harrison puts out the paper, but he also he refuses an offer of $10,000 from a white supporter, because he said, no, we want to keep this a black thing, and we don't want, someone else dictating the politics of our newspaper and our organization. So that makes him very different than what comes later. And I get into this in volume 2, but how Du Bois got his money, and how, from either the Garland Fund, which is a fund that was set up and gave money to certain groups, or from Spingarn, who was the head of the NAACP, a close personal friend of Du Bois and Du Bois's closest white friend who helped him financially, or the messenger of Owen and Randolph, which also got money from the Garland Fund, or Garvey, who found other means to get financial support, if you will. Harrison tried that different road, but it was a difficult road, so he ran into problems. And by 1919, his voice, he had to stop publishing it. But in 1918, while he's still putting out The Voice, he and William Monroe Trotter convene a meeting in D.C. That's the Liberty Congress, and it has men and women from 35 states who go to D.C. to put forth demands for, as I said before, enforcement of 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and federal anti-lynching legislation. What's significant about that is the NAACP, although people associate it with anti-lynching work, in this period and into the 1920s would not support anti-lynching legislation, because they didn't, quote, according to some people who commented on it, they didn't want to alienate white support, Southern white support. So the NAACP wouldn't push it. And Joel Spingarn, who was the head of the NAACP and Du Bois's closest white friend, was also a major in military intelligence during World War I. Please hear what I've got to say. Military intelligence was that branch of the government that monitored the Black and the radical community, and Spingarn was a major in military intelligence during this period. And Spingarn tried to convene an editors' conference to meet a week before the meeting called by Harrison and Trotter, also in D.C. He wanted to have this meeting to undermine the effort of Harrison and Trotter's group. He also, as I said earlier, was the closest white friend, by Du Bois's own admission, of Du Bois. And in that period, Du Bois, and I assume Spingarn was talking to him or influencing him, but I'll assume Du Bois made his own decision. Du Bois did two things. One, Du Bois put in an application for a captaincy in military intelligence. That's that branch of the military, of the military intelligence, which monitors the Black and the radical communities. And Du Bois wrote an editorial, which was probably the editorial he was most embarrassed about for the remainder of his life. It was entitled Close Ranks.
Close Ranks.
And in that editorial, Du Bois said, while this war lasts, let us forget our special grievances and close ranks behind Wilson's war effort. And the special grievances, as Harrison knew, as Du Bois had indicated a few weeks earlier in the crisis, and as many in the Black press knew, were lynching, segregation, disfranchisement. So Harrison took Du Bois to task in his publication, The Voice. He basically said, you know, we can differ on the war, but you don't have to take it where you took it, where you're, closing ranks and forgetting our special grievances. And he criticized that strongly. And he also exposed the fact that Du Bois put in for the captaincy in military intelligence. And basically from that time on, Du Bois would not speak to Harrison any longer, and that's part of, I go into all of these things in some length, but it's important reading for people to know today, I think. And and when Booker T had Harrison fired, it's because Harrison had written letters to the New York Sun critical of Booker T. So just like today, you criticize these big shots and they make you pay.
I want to interject here because this is very important. What you're basically proposing, Jeff, is that the two preeminent Black thinkers of the early 20th century who have predominant control over the direction of Black thought and political ideology, both of them were pretty much pawns of white capital or white intelligence. Booker T. Washington was completely a tool of the capitalist industrialists in the South and the North. In the South, when he gave his Atlanta Compromise speech, and in the North through the Carnegies and all the other multimillionaires. And there's a really good piece by Manning Marable where he talks about Booker T. Washington's agenda, and he tries to dissuade Blacks from organizing unions and having working class oriented politics in this era. Booker T. Washington dies in 1915. And Du Bois, who many consider the father of liberal Black thought, was working under the tutelage of a man whose job as a military intelligence officer was to investigate radical Black activity as an agent.
Arthur E. Spingarn, who was Du Bois's closest white friend, to this day, the NAACP gives their award for outstanding achievement by a Black American. It's called the Spingarn Medal. It's in his name. And with all this talk about taking down the Woodrow Wilson statues and the Robert E. Lee, and all this, I haven't heard much questioning of the Spingarn Medal, and how it's named and who it's named for and what role he played. So that's food for thought for people.
And what's fascinating here about Du Bois in this era is that Hubert Harrison exposes that Du Bois is encouraging Black men to join the U.S. military in World War I under the argument that, because I've read that piece, Close Ranks, that Black people will be viewed as patriotic liberators of America and will be beloved for their participation in the war. And he does this in exchange for the capacity to be receiving a military intelligence commission.
Which he doesn't get.
Right? But this is what's even more nefarious. Black men do sign up in large number to fight in World War I. And when they come back from their service, they're facing urban riots and lynchings and all types of rebellions from all over the country and are being persecuted for even being seen with their uniforms on. Am I correct or incorrect, Jeff?
You're correct. And again, I want to just encourage people to get volume 2 of the Harrison biography, because I recount many of the uprisings in a lot of these cities, the protests. It was a very militant summer. They called it the Red Summer, yes. And Harrison's writing some important pieces in that time. And some of this starts after, in late 1918, early 19, before all the riots, Harrison had tried to take his Liberty League down into Washington, D.C. and to Virginia. He tried to take it down south, the area of the greatest concentration of African Americans. And he gave talks in various places, in D.C. repeatedly, and in Virginia, parts of Virginia. And later on, some of the military intelligence people wrote that these talks seemed to really catch on amongst his audiences, and they saw some relation between the militancy and Harrison's talks,
Incredible. So what I want to get into is what was the actual program that Hubert Harrison was advancing? Some people said that Hubert Harrison had the best program for Black America than any of the leaders, Du Bois, Booker T, and Garvey, at all in that era. What was the actual details of that program? And next, I'd like to go into his relationship with Garvey after you detail what his program was.
Right.
And I would like to add, if we can also kind of touch on a little bit, one interesting thing about Hubert Harrison, and you write about extensively, is that he also had a class critique. So it wasn't simply just a race-first critique, but a very interesting class critique. And it seems like, from what I'm gathering from your writing, Jeff, is that his upbringing in St. Croix kind of gives him a little bit of a class perspective that is missing when he hits very, very violent Harlem at the time, because it's not just violent amongst the tenement housing he's living in. It's violent because of these race riots, and it's definitely not the race riots I think people are accustomed to seeing post the 60s. These are white mob terrorizing predominantly black neighborhoods.
Fine. Regarding both questions, let me start with the Crucian roots, and then we'll come up to the program of the Liberty League. One thing that I spent some time with in volume 1 is Harrison's Crucian roots. And I was able to do some serious research. And while I was writing, a fellow down in St. Croix named George Tyson put together a thing called the St. Croix African Roots Project. Marvelous work of scholarship. And I was able to trace Harrison's family and things like that. But I also learned a lot more, as being somebody born here. And I made numerous trips to St. Croix and spoke with a lot of people about St. Croix history. And Harrison writes about St. Croix, sometimes very extensively and with, I think, great precision and insight. But St. Croix was different than the U.S. in certain key ways. And I get this combining Harrison's writings and Allen. And in some ways, St. Croix was like Barbados and Jamaica, the English-speaking Caribbean, in that in St. Croix, I'm going to speak about St. Croix, in the under slavery, you had a small European population, perhaps 5%. Majority plantation working labor force was Black, and they were 80%, and 15% so-called mulattoes, whatever you want to call them, and they played a little intermediary zone. Whereas in the U.S., you had the color line drawn a touch of Black blood and you were Black, right? So what that meant was, going back historically, under slavery, the slave patrol in the U.S. was lily white, whereas in St. Croix, free coloreds played a role in the slave patrol, if you will. Land holding, basically no Blacks could own land or buy, in the U.S., in the southern U.S., in the way back, going back under slavery. But in St. Croix, there was a significant portion of the colored population who had access to home ownership. Harrison lived in a house, an estate owned by two people of color. And another thing is, in terms of the history of struggle, St. Croix had, I think, the second emancipation victory after Haiti. St. Croix was 1848. And part of the reason that emancipation victory was successful was because the free colored lined up with the black plantation laborers, and they were successful in ending slavery. They also had passed in St. Croix an edict of full equality, right, between the between European Crucians and colored Crucians. Now, in the U.S., no such thing. There was the Dred Scott decision. So no black had any rights which a white was bound to respect. So the color line was drawn very differently. And a few things it meant. One, Harrison, although he lived in poverty, he was able to go into the church in Christiansted and read books, when he was very young. And he was able to learn from the best teacher on the island, a black teacher named Wilford Jackson, who's the father of his friend, D. Hamilton Jackson, who became a leader in St. Croix. So he had certain opportunities that were not afforded the majority of African Americans in this country. So when he comes to the U.S., Harrison writes, after a 1904 lynching or race riot. He comes 1900, New York City had just witnessed a series of race riots, but he writes after a 1904 lynching, he writes into a letter to the New York Times how this was a horror. I think his word was a horror, and he criticizes strongly lynching in the U.S., and it was something he didn't know back home. And that was, I think, true for a lot of people. So Harrison, coming with the background he had, the non-acceptance of existing race relations in the U.S., some of the opportunities he had, and just his perspective, he was really geared up, as were a lot of other Afro-Caribbeans, to challenge much of this. So in the early 20th century, you'll see people like Richard B. Moore, like Cyril Briggs, Hodge Kiernan, who was mentioned before, is from Montserrat, just a number of people who play active roles in all these radical movements. Now, Harrison, first he's in study groups with Schomburg and Bruce, but then he goes into the free thought movement for a while because he breaks from religion. This is another major break in Harrison's life, because the Black church is one of the major institutions in the Black community, but he breaks from it. And it's a torturous break, as he details in his diary, and it's detailed in the books. But then he goes into the Socialist Party. And when he goes into the Socialist Party, Harrison pours his heart out for socialism. He speaks as many as 23 times a week for Debs during the 1912 campaign. He goes down to Broad and Wall Street in 1911 and goes out on the corner of Broad and Wall Street at 1 o'clock and speaks for 3 hours until they close the stock exchange on socialism. And the New York Times is writing about this. They've never seen anything like it. I refer to it as an early Occupy Wall Street. And he go all around speaking on socialism. He writes major articles on the Negro and socialism. And when he's doing that, he's a working class guy. Harrison's working in the post office since 1907. That's what he knows. And when he's writing these pieces, he writes important things explaining that a couple of his statements that I think are very important for people to understand are: politically, the Negro is the touchstone of the modern democratic idea, which is profound, because a touchstone, and I think I have one right here someplace. Yep, here it is. People not familiar what a touchstone is. This is a touchstone. Can you see this? It's a black stone. You rub the metal against it to see if it's really the gold it purports to be. You take any issue in society, how are Black people faring? Housing, education, literacy. Put it to the test. How are they faring? What are we going to do about it? Harrison writes, the mission of the Socialist Party is to free the working class from exploitation, and the duty of this party, the Socialist Party, to champion the Negro's cause is as clear as day. This is the crucial test of socialism's sincerity. He writes this in 1912, a year before Du Bois comes out with his statement, the Negro problem is the great test of the American socialist. Harrison challenged the two main ideological props of white supremacy, the idea that racism is innate and the idea that white workers benefit from race prejudice. He also appealed, there were two factions in the Socialist Party when Harrison was in it. The political evolutionary socialists who wanted to try and move towards socialism through elections, etc., and the industrial revolutionary socialists who wanted militant strikes and militant actions. And Harrison again emphasized the duty of the party is to champion the cause of the Negro. If you want evolutionary gains, you need Black voters. If you want revolutionary gains, you need Black workers, etc. So he was really on the mark with all these issues. But what happens when he's in the socialists, he puts before the party at the 1912 convention, Southernism or socialism, what's going to be the direction of the Socialist Party? And the Socialist Party ignores the Negro question. And he's been writing on it now in 1911 and 1912 in the party's leading journals. But they do take up Asian immigration, and they oppose Asian immigration, and they issue a statement which offers some of the most profound racist, if you will, analysis on race that by the socialists in that period. They say race feeling is not so much a result of social as of biological evolution. It is deeper than any class feeling. This is the socialists writing this. Class consciousness must be learned, but race consciousness is inborn. That's the exact arguments Harrison's taking on. So what happens, then Harrison is active at the Patterson strike in 1913 with Gurley Flynn and Big Bill Haywood. But by 1914, after a number of other incidents, he is ready to leave the Socialist Party. And he's going to leave the Socialist Party, and he explains why. And it's arguably the most profound but least heated criticism in U.S. left history, I think. And this is why it's really unfortunate for 100 years we hadn't learned more about Harrison. He stated simply that the Socialist Party, and then I put in brackets, like the labor movement, has insisted on brackets white, race first and class after, that it put brackets the white in brackets race first before class. In other words, socialists put the white race, socialists and labor movement put the white race first before class. If we had heard that message and learned from it, we might have been a lot better off on the left, nowadays. So he left the socialists over because they were putting the white race first. And that's why he moves to build race unity from the bottom up. And that's when he moves to build a race conscious movement, his Liberty League and Voice amongst the program, because that was one of the questions that was asked. They opposed lynching, segregation, and disfranchisement. They wanted enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Mm-hmm. They wanted federal anti-lynching legislation. They wanted a political voice. Harrison's paper was the Voice, and he wanted to demand a political voice. And they advocated armed self-defense. This is quite a militant program for Harrison. And he said, it was made clear that this new Negro, this is Harrison writing, this new Negro movement represented a breaking away of the Negro masses from the grip of old-time leaders. So that's a little taste of what he did. And then in July 2nd, 1917, a month after he founded the organization, just another anecdote worthy of mention, I got two more, is East St. Louis erupts in rioting, if you will. where it's led by white labor's attack on the African-American communities. East St. Louis, African-Americans had been coming up from down south to get jobs. And these riots were fueled by the labor leaders and labor people. And they attacked the African-American community, torched a lot of it. And it's important to note, East St. Louis is in Missouri, and it's 12 miles from Ferguson, which a few years ago we had a big protest in Harlem over Ferguson incident. And Harrison, back in 1917, calls a Harlem rally attended by over 1,000 people to protest East St. Louis. One other thing I want to mention about Harrison and his Liberty League and Voice, it emphasized a responsibility, the international responsibility of the 1,700 million, a responsibility to the 1,700 millions who are colored, black, brown, and yellow, and who seek to live free from the domination of a white minority. And what is of note is Harrison's flag of the Liberty League in 1917, when he founded it, was black, brown, and yellow. And from this, Marcus Garvey later changed to red, black, and green. And Harrison offers some comments on that change. And I'll leave it to readers to see Harrison's comments in the book.
Wow, well, I got several questions I want to ask you.
Sure.
Does Harrison, though he leaves the Socialist Party, we had a whole show talking about Debs and how the Socialist Party basically was not offering anything significant to Black Americans at that time, but that as a consequence, people like Cyril Briggs, the African Black Brotherhood, go into and join the Communist Party after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. After leaving the Socialist Party, does Harrison abandon his critique of capitalism and desire for socialism at all? Does he maintain it? And the next question is, what stopped him from joining the communists, who the blacks who will left the Socialist Party, like Cyril Briggs, who joined the Communist Party?
Very good questions. No, he doesn't. He's very critical of capitalism, throughout his whole life, basically. Essentially anyway. And but he doesn't see that the socialists are moving in that direction. And I think actually Briggs and some of the other people joined the Communist Party a few years after 1917. And Harrison is actually invited to a meeting with Rose Pastor Stokes, I think Briggs, and a few others, in which they want to try and get some of the leading Black activists to work with them, join their organization. And they wanted Harrison particularly to be a stalking horse, but particularly a stalking horse against Garvey, because by this time Harrison's editing Garvey's paper, and he's the most influential Black leader in Harlem. And he refuses to go that way. They even offer money, more money, and apparently Briggs takes the money, and that's in part how he pays for the Crusader and some of his funding. I go into this in volume 2, and I think you'll find it interesting. But Harrison says he wants to go alone, but he's also, he didn't think at that time, because people like Randolph and Owen, and particularly Randolph and Owen, they didn't understand that part of the appeal of Garvey was to the Black masses, and they didn't understand that, how significant that was. And he goes into detail about how when there was those uprisings of 1919, etc., sometimes the Black radicals in the left that you're talking about like to claim credit for their work being the militant factor behind those demonstrations. And Harrison says, no, he thinks it was other things. It was the conditions Black people were facing and stuff like that. And he disagreed that they had a very significant impact in those early years. But again, all of this I go into and I discuss, but people can go into it themselves. And I've got a lot of good sources and footnotes, and I think you'll find much, much of interest. So I hope you in particular, Pascal, get a chance to look at that stuff.
Yeah, because what we do see, though, is that the Communist Party and the communists overall pick up the mantle where the socialists drop off and actually do become, at least before the Popular Front, the faction of the left that actually puts in serious dedication to the Black cause.
Yeah.
In the South and the North.
Let me give you a little more on that. When Claude McKay goes to Moscow and they want him to write a piece, which became a book. McKay wrote a book on Negroes of America or something like that. And they wanted him to write on it. While he's in the Soviet Union, they give him Harrison's book as a source of reference, to write on it. And one thing a lot of people don't know is in 1924, when Harrison founds the International Colored Unity League, it was his last effort, a little bit like Malcolm's Organization of Afro-American Unity in his last years. Harrison, one of the planks of Harrison's International Colored Unity League is a Negro nation in the U.S. And this is 3 or 4 years before the communist.
The Black Belt thesis.
Yeah. Well, he didn't have it in the Black Belt. He had it out west, but it was the idea of a Negro nation. And then in 25 and 26, Harrison is again, he's open to working with the communists, and he's working for the Workers' Party, delivering some lectures at the Workers' Party School, and he goes on a Midwest tour that Love at Fort Whiteman, I think, was organizing, in 1924, 25. So he's working with them. But come 1926, there's a strike at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem. And in that strike, and again, I discuss it, but Harrison concludes that the left activists were being taken in by the white union position and things like that. And he states, as had been said 100 years, 60 years before, my object in this struggle is not to save the Union, but to free the slaves or something like that. In other words, he sided with the Black workers against the Union, which the party was supporting, because they wanted Black workers to go out on the lines, risk their jobs to protect the white job, but the white workers weren't asked to do the same. It gets a little involved, but that's discussed. So, but he maintained ties with some of the Black communists, and he was active with them, but he never, I don't think he ever joined the Communist Party. He was in their the Workers' Party, and taught at the Workers' School, things like that.
Well, the thing is, though, he was also a big supporter. He wrote a big praise of Debs when he died. He was a big praiser of Debs, and Debs was more conservative than the communists were.
Yeah, I don't know how big a praise he wrote, but he was a supporter of Debs for sure, and he didn't come out hammering at Debs when he moved away from it, because there were other people in the party that he went after, but and he campaigned for Debs as many as 23 times a week in 1912. What happened in 1912 was Du Bois, who was in the Socialist Party, left the Socialist Party to campaign for Woodrow Wilson. And
wow.
Yeah, and Woodrow Wilson wins, and he shortly brings Birth of a Nation into the White House. He goes into Haiti, Dominican Republic, all these things, and leads us into war eventually. And Harrison didn't do that. He didn't go that way, like he didn't go to the extreme of supporting Wilson. By the way, I've got one more thing I've got to tell you. You may know this or may not, but in the Harrison book, I talk about in that period in the teens, and I get into in one of my footnotes, FDR, who was assistant Secretary of the Navy or sometime.
In Haiti. He wrote the Constitution in Haiti.
Yeah, bragging about it. Yeah. Well, you know your stuff, right? But I think Harrison commented on that or some such, but he was on the money, with a lot of that stuff.
So
Well-
I want to understand how exactly he justifies supporting Debs, who was much weaker on the issue of race than the communists, and being tepid about the black participation in the Communist Party.
Well, he had been through some things in the period, right? He was no longer a supporter of the socialists at all, but he started out a supporter of the Bolsheviks. You know, he in 1917 and 18, he's writing some positive things about it, but he just doesn't see them in that period addressing the quote Negro question in that period in the U.S. And I go into some of the history and the dates and the years of statements. And Briggs doesn't go straight into the Communist Party either. Yeah, I know. And Moore doesn't go straight into the Communist Party. It takes a while. And one of the big things that happens is this meeting in, I believe it's 1921, where Briggs is there, Harrison's there, I think McKay is there, maybe one or two other leading black activists. And Rose Pastor Stokes wants to get them to come and get with the program of the party and offers money. And Harrison steps back and he basically says, and I think he writes in his diary some such, nope, I didn't want to go that way. You know, he just didn't have confidence in them yet. You know, he hadn't seen enough to trust them. And he didn't want to be dictated by other people's money. He wanted to go his own way.
Well, to be fair, the party does become more militant in 24 and after 24. You know, Lenin definitely supports the Negro question, definitely, at least rhetorically, during the revolution. But definitely after 1924, they do become more militant, and this is kind of coming towards the end of Harrison's life at the time.
Right, but you know, and since you're so familiar with this, I think it would be wonderful if you look a little more closely at what he writes about that Negro Nation in 24 and tie it in, because I think it precedes the USCP coming out with any position like that, you know, and I'm pretty sure it does, as a matter of fact. And I wonder how much Harrison's writings may have influenced the CP.
Well, I want to talk about
Pascal, because we're over the hour right now.
Oh.
So let me ask everybody this. Would you want to go another 20 minutes or so, Jeff? You got that in you?
Sure. I'm okay if you guys are.
Good.
I'm good. Yeah, no, I want to get
Okay,
to
let me wrap this so we can make sure we sit right, because this program has some issues. So I'm going to play the end music. And so for our patrons out there, we're going to have the rest of this conversation on Patreon. So as soon as you're done with this, there will be a link up for you to listen to this very, very deep dive. Please look at the look on Pascal's face so you know the questions are about to get good. I'm actually very excited because this is something that we got into, I think it's like 3 months ago. We had this Eugene Debs episode kind of challenging a bit of a new leftist love for Debs. You know, we don't have to get into the weeds about how there's kind of a
let me just say something, Jason. Harrison doesn't go there with that new leftist love type thing. He's not like that. I mean, he campaigned vigorously when he was in the party. But there's one other thing I want to say.
Hold on, Jeff.
Okay, I'm going to wait.
We got to stand for the paywall. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you guys are enjoying whatever you want to call today. I hope you're enjoying it with your family. And we are out.